Hey guys, and welcome to this episode of the Happy Knitting Podcast. My name is Julia and I'm coming to you from Germany. Today is Saturday, March 9th, although it won't be when you're watching this. This is going to be a special episode, so if you're looking for your more standard podcast content, maybe go back a couple of episodes, because today I will not be talking about whips and FOs and such, but it is going to be a questions and answers video. So a while ago I had asked you guys to ask me all the questions that you wanted to be answered. I have forgotten how to speak English. I'm very sorry about that. There's a question about that too. But anyhow, I have my computer right here because my printer decided not to print today. So I'm going to be going through the questions, through most of the questions that you asked me, and I have kind of grouped them. So we start with the very knitting heavy things at the beginning, and then we will talk about knitting related things and not so knitting related things towards the end. I'm not sure how long this will take, so if it ends up being a very long video, I will split it into 2 episodes, and if we get through it rather quickly, it will just be one video. We will see how it goes. So excuse me while I look over here. The first question was, do you like to knit stuffies? Do you find them fiddly? And yes, I do find them terribly fiddly, which is why I don't really knit them. Which is really sad because I love stuffies. They're really beautiful. Like, I love seeing other people's stuffies. It's just that for me, knitting is very much about the rhythm and the relaxation. And because you tend to knit things only over a couple of stitches and you constantly need to chain things and you're knitting at a very tight gauge, and most of the time you're knitting on DPNs, it's not something that I find very enjoyable. But I do want to get more into that at some point in my life, because I have a 2-year-old niece who I think would love stuffies. And like I said, I do really like the aesthetic of knitted stuffies. I just don't really enjoy doing it, or I haven't really enjoyed it so far. But it is something I do want to try in the future. Second question, have you ever crocheted? Yes, I have. I learned to crochet and to knit as a child, and then before I got back into knitting as an adult, I actually crocheted a couple of hats, because that seemed to be very much on trend here in Germany about 4 or 5 years ago. So I got some yarn. I think I got Maiboshi yarn, which is very popular here in Germany. I crocheted a couple of hats and then kind of decided, well, I get how that works now I want to knit. So I don't want to be looking down at crocheters, because sometimes I feel like crocheters kind of get looked down upon, and I totally don't. I can't believe what you can do with crochet. It's just, for me, I think my heart was always in knitting, so I didn't really pursue it anymore. But I do really enjoy crochet blankets. So I have finished a granny square blanket in the past, and I'm working on a granny stripe blanket every now and then. So I do enjoy that part of crochet. I just don't have enough time. I'm really sorry. I feel like I have all this yarn and fiber around me, and I have fluff up my nose. Over the last year, you have tried quite a variety of yarns. Do you have a favorite? And there are a couple of questions like that. You guys are making it really hard for me. I would like to preface this with the fact that I'm not sponsored by anyone. So all the things that I'm going to show are just examples of things that I like, and I'm not getting anything from promoting these companies. It's just my personal taste. Over the last year, one yarn that really surprised me, and I didn't really expect it to, was this yarn. This is yarn by a Danish company, and it's the Black Hill wool. I will put the name, I will try to remember to put it down here, but it's from a company called Garn og Salg. They're in Denmark. They are very hard to get, but I knit a sweater out of their yarn. I actually didn't use their balled up yarn, but their sort of yarn that comes in cake with all the spinning oil, so it didn't look as nice as this. And it turned into a really fluffy, airy sweater, so that has definitely been one of the yarns in the last year that I was really impressed with. Next up, what is your favorite yarn in your stash at the moment? Again, these questions are incredibly hard because I love so many different kinds of yarn. I'm a huge yarnie, as you know. But one yarn that I really, really enjoy working with and have worked with in the past is this, which is Jamieson and Smith 2-ply jumper weight. This is Shetland wool. It is again a woolly wool, and I just think they have great colors, and I keep buying more, and every time I get a little ball I kind of want a sweater's quantity because I really enjoy this. So this is one yarn in my stash that I really, really like. But again, there are at least 20 or 30 more different yarns that I love as well. What is your all-time favorite sock yarn? That is, seriously, I'm not going to answer that. I think it's really hard to answer these questions because there are many different yarns and they have different purposes. So on one hand, I love commercial sock yarn like Regia, like Opal. There are different brands in different countries, but these are the ones that are in Germany, so they are very easy to get hold of. They're affordable. I think knitting sometimes it can be very expensive, and I think knitting needs to be affordable. I think knitting needs to be something that everyone can do. And with these yarns, Opal and Regia, like or West Yorkshire spinners, like the yarns that come in a ball and you can just knit from them. Very many times there are self-patterning, self-striping. I think they are just great basic yarns to work with, and I still really enjoy working with these. In terms of more fancy schmancy yarns, I love knitting sort of the 80-20 merino and nylon blend yarns. So if your sock yarns have merino in them, they tend to be just a little bit more soft and round and a little bit nicer to work with. But there are so many sock dyes, sock yarn dyes, and I really, really couldn't choose. What I would say is that I tend to use Superwash yarn for socks, and I do wash all of my socks in the machine. So that is my preference, but really don't make me choose. The next person was planning to knit some DK weight mittens and asked what would be the best yarn for that, or if I have any recommendations. And I will start off with the fact that as she is trying to knit color work, I would always recommend NonSuperwash yarn for color work because it just works better. It's just meant to be. I don't knit with a lot of DK weight yarn. But I am actually planning to knit a DK weight mitten pattern soon, and I'm planning to use this yarn. This is Rauma Fine Garn. This is actually not DK, it's more of a sport weight, but I think you can knit it at a DK weight gauge. At least that's what I'm going to do. So that's what I would recommend as one option, but again, I'm not a really good person to ask because I don't tend to knit with DK. I'm also not a big person when it comes to knitting mittens. I tend to be more on like the sweater and sock kick, so I don't know if I'm the best person to ask. Next up, what yarn would you recommend for a first time color work sweater? Again, if it's color work, I would recommend a non-superwash yarn. I know that lots of people are knitting color work sweaters with superwash yarns, even with singles yarns, and really you can do whatever you want. I don't want to be telling you guys what you can and cannot do, but I think you're making it easier for yourself if you're using one of the non-superwash yarns that I've shown you. If you're a new color work knitter or maybe even a new sweater knitter, I would always recommend not going for the finest yarn possible, but maybe for a DK weight. Sport weight, worsted weight, maybe even a bulky if you feel like it. Just because I think your first colorwork sweater, you don't want to be, working on it for a year and then you kind of feel bad because you're not finishing it. I definitely feel like, especially for the beginning, try to stick with yarn that you enjoy. Maybe it's something that's not super expensive, so you don't feel like you're wasting away $100 or whatever on a sweater that may not be perfect, because really practice makes perfect, and your first colorwork sweater will be great. Probably your 10th colorwork sweater will be even greater. So I think any yarn will work, but I would choose a non-superwash woolly wool, and if you're not a super patient knitter, maybe not a fingering weight, but a decay or worsted weight yarn. Again, these aren't decay or worsted, but at least these two, they can be knit at a decay weight gauge, and you can't really go wrong. I know a lot of people also use Holst yarn, again, another yarn that I really enjoy. And you can also just hold that double, and that'll be really easy, and it won't be so fiddly as if you're knitting with a single strand, which, as you can see, is very, very thin. Also, use a yarn that you love, because if you love the yarn, if you love working with it, you're definitely going to enjoy it more. You have tried a lot of different yarns. Which do you prefer, superwash or non-superwash? So if you've been looking at what I've been showing you and also what I'm wearing, this is also Holst Super Soft. You can definitely tell my preference. I love my non-superwash yarns because I just love wool, and I like my fiber, if possible, not to be too processed. I don't necessarily need blends. I just really enjoy woolly wool, and therefore for color work, which is my preference, these non-superwash yarns are great. Having said that, I'm no opponent of superwash. I use superwash yarn for socks, and I have knit superwash yarn for sweaters as well, so I don't think I need to choose, but at the moment, I really like the non-superwash things because they're just, you can feel the wool a little bit more. It smells sheepy, but again, I'm lucky because I'm not super sensitive, and I know other people tend to be more sensitive and scratchy and itchy, and maybe superwash will be better for them. I would like to know what gives you a bigger thrill. Is it A, knitting from your stash, or B, adding new yarn to your stash? This is a really hard question. I know you want me to choose either A or B, but I'm not going to. It's not really the adding yarn to my stash that I love so much as that I love finding new things and, you know, receiving a new yarn and feeling it. And the same thing goes from knitting from stash. I don't love the fact that I'm using up my stash, but like caking a yarn up and then knitting your first stitches with it, and you know, you start your swatch and you see the fabric and you see how it turns into a garment. Like, that process to me is magical. So I'm not sure if that's answering any of your questions, but for me personally, I love buying yarn not because I want to add it to my stash, but just because I want to knit with it, and hence knitting from my stash gives me a lot of joy, and I just love trying all the new yarns. When you cast on for a sweater or shawl or sock, which cast on do you use? I use a long tail cast on pretty much for everything. So I'm not fancy. I know tubular cast-ons look beautiful. I have yet to try it. I'm just too lazy. So I just use a boring German long tail cast on, and I use that for everything, and it works just fine. Next up, other than vanilla socks, which is the pattern that you have re-knit the most? I'm assuming you don't want to hear the fishless kiss heel, because that is part of a vanilla sock. I have knit probably close to 100 fish lips kiss heels in my life. In terms of socks, I've already also knit quite a lot of vanilla latte socks, which is a great free pattern. I have knit a couple of pairs of Hermione's everyday socks. And in terms of sweaters, I don't think I've knit, I was going to say I haven't knit any pattern more than twice, but I have knit 3 pavement sweaters, and I would definitely knit a 4th one, so that definitely counts. I would love to know which method of sock knitting you like the most, toe up or cuff down. Definitely cuff down. I have knit maybe 4 or 5 patterns which were toe up, and I just never really got into toe up sock knitting. This is very personal, but I just like to knit my leg first and then the heel and then the toe. I can't really describe it any other way. One thing that definitely influences that is the fact that when you knit toe up, you obviously have to cast off. And I have never found a stretchy bind off in the rib that works as well for socks as the ribbing and beginning of your sock that you get if you cast on. So just the binding off for me is just not as easy as casting on and then doing a Kitchener stitch at the bottom. So I think I will always be a cuff down sock knitter, just out of habit as well. I would love to know if there is any knitting technique or stitch you really dislike or just aren't too fond of. And the viewer says that short rows get her every time. I used to not really like short rows, but really I've gotten so used to them and I now don't mind them at all. Knitting techniques and stitches that I'm not too fond of. There are a couple that I haven't tried yet, so intarsia or entrelac knitting are just techniques that don't really appeal to me right now, even though I think they would be cool to learn. I'm also not a big cable knitter. Knitting cables with a cable needle just annoys the heck out of me. But I'm trying to get back into cables, and I think there are a lot of cables that you can knit without a cable needle, so that is definitely something that I want to try in the future. One person is always interested how other people store their knitted items. I don't have a perfect system, to be honest. I'm very worried about moths and such. So I have all of my socks in a plastic tote, or a plastic box, I should say, with a lid in my closet, and my entire closet, which is where I also store my sweaters and such, is stuffed with like moth repellents and lavender sachets. And we change those up really, really regularly. We have had issues with like tiny carpet beetles. So I try to just be vigilant, and I also every now and then take out all of my knits and I wash them and hang them outside to dry. But like I said, I don't have a perfect system for them. And I will always have some knits out. So I always have a couple of sweaters, and in the winter a couple of hats and mittens in rotation. And to be honest, they're just flying around the apartment. And then when it gets summery, I just put them away. So not a super great system here, but it seems to work. I've had one shawl eaten last year by these stupid little beetles, but I have now been taking more care of them, so I think I'm safe for now. Do you ever declutter your stash? And if so, how do you go on about it? I'm not very good at doing destashes, but what I do is I tend to go through my stash every now and then, because I have a system in my stash, and then as I podcast and I put things away and I just need space for my yarn, I tend to sometimes just put it everywhere, and then at some point I will get annoyed because it doesn't make sense anymore, and then I will usually take everything out, look at it, and put it back into the stash in a more orderly fashion. And generally, I think I have a pretty good idea of what I have, and all the things that I have, with very, very few exceptions, are things that I know what I want to do with, or at least I know that I want those skeins to be a sweater or a shawl or socks, and I don't have a ton of things in there that I generally dislike. What I will do every now and then, if I just have things that I know other people would maybe appreciate more, or I just don't want it to be in my stash forever, I will literally just give it away. Or sometimes you look at these things and you thought maybe you aren't as interested, and then you go back half a year later and you suddenly really like it again. So I don't tend to do any destashes. I don't really declutter my stash. I'm definitely not Marie Kondoing my stash, but I do go through it every now and then. How do you store your patterns? I don't really have any paper patterns. I have very few books, I think maybe 4 or 5 pattern books, 4 of which are sock books, and 1 is the shawl book by Melanie Berg. Everything else is in my Ravelry inbox, so it's all digital, which means I don't need to print anything, I don't need to store anything, and I'm very much a digital pattern person. I knit everything from my phone or my tablet. And that works really well for me because I don't write into my patterns. If I make any modifications that I need to remember, I will always just put them in my project pages. So that system works for me really well. I realize that lots of people have different systems, and I would be very interested to hear yours. But thanks to Ravelry, which is amazing, I don't really need any fancy pattern storage. A German person asked what online stores I order my yarn from. And the honest answer is I can't really tell you because I don't have like 3 or 5 different online stores that I tend to, browse and then buy things. I tend to buy from tons of different shops, but most of the time only once. Because the way that I get inspired to buy yarns online is that I will see someone else knitting with it, I will see a yarn on Ravelry, and then I will just go online and see where I can find it, at what price, and where I can find the colors that I want. So there are a few exceptions, but as weird as it sounds, most of the time I know what I want to buy before I really go into an online yarn shop. And then once I do, I just pick the one that has the color that I want in the quantity that I want, because again, I tend to buy a lot of sweater quantities, so you obviously need more than one skein of a color. I try to buy from German online stores as much as I can because A, it's usually the cheapest option in terms of shipping, and B, it just makes sense. I don't want, yarn to be carted out around uselessly around the globe if it doesn't have to be. With the exception that sometimes, for example, with the yarns that I showed you, it's cheapest and easiest to get them from the supplier. So for example, my Holst yarn, I ordered from Holst directly online, and they ship it from Denmark, and it's sometimes here quicker than if I order in Germany. Sometimes you can also get cones or larger quantities or discounts if you buy from the supplier. So for example, Jamieson & Smith I have bought in Germany, but I've also bought it from them directly to get a couple of cones in the past. So that is kind of the only time when I do that. And generally, if I don't buy from Germany, most of the things that I buy are from the UK. I don't ever order online from the US or Canada or Australia or New Zealand because customs are really, really annoying and I just can't deal with them, and I think it's crazy expensive with shipping. Have you ever lost your knitting mojo? If yes, how did you deal with it? Yes, I have, even though I think I am lucky that I tend to pretty much always want to knit. So I don't lose my knitting mojo very often. What happens sometimes is I finish a couple of things and I'm really, really pumped to cast something new on, and then I get decision paralysis and I just don't know what to cast on, and I will stand in front of my stash, which is quite large, and think I have nothing that I want to knit. But that's not really losing my knitting mojo, that's just I can't decide what I want to do. But in the few times that I have lost my knitting mojo, I think it's best to just accept it, do a couple of other things, like there's no point in forcing your knitting mojo, and if you then force yourself to do something, it's very likely that you won't enjoy it, or maybe you will have to rip it out again. I like to do different crafts when I don't feel like knitting, so I will spin, or what is always a good idea for me is to work on my blankets, because I have a couple of blankets on the go and they tend to just kind of sit there for months at a time. And when I don't know what to knit next, what to cast on, just working on a blanket is kind of, it gives you the satisfaction of knitting without having to make a decision. I would like to know if your hands or arms or elbows ever get tired of knitting. Do you get pain or exhaustion from knitting too much? And a couple of people have asked that, especially because I knit a lot and I knit very fast, and of course the question is very logical. I don't really get any issues, which is not to say that I haven't had issues in the past. At the moment, when I have pains in my wrists or my arms, it's mostly from spinning, so I know I need to be more careful when I spin. I'm very much used to knitting, so I think without being a doctor or anything. I think practice is definitely a factor. And again, it also just depends on what yarn you knit with. So I knit with a lot of wool, which has a little bit of stretch. And then if you're not knitting at a super tight gauge, it can be very easy to knit without putting any strain on yourself. But if, for example, I started knitting a super tight colorwork pattern on tiny needles, or if I knit with cotton, for example, cotton gives me the worst wrist pains. So I think it has a lot to do with gauge, and knitting at a loose gauge that is comfortable to you. And if you feel like sometimes, I don't know if you know this, but for me, a lot of times I try to influence my gauge by knowing that I need to knit relatively tightly, for example, and that will hurt my hands. So really, it's important to use the right needle size that then you can knit comfortably and not cramp up, and then I personally don't get any pains. The other thing that I think is really important is to just check your posture as you're knitting. So I do notice sometimes when, for example, something isn't working or I've made a mistake in my lace pattern, I start to kind of cramp up and sit like that. And obviously that is really, really unhealthy. So I think it's just important to check your posture, make sure you're sitting comfortably when you're knitting, and then I can basically just knit for hours and hours. Tips for healthy knitting habits, I think I've just explained that. I think what's also important is if you're having pains, just stop. I know it's very tempting to push through it and you want to finish something, maybe even gift knitting, but take a break and come back to it later. It's really, really important. I'm very, very chronically bad at that. I will just push through, and Kai will scold me for that. But really, if you're having pains, if maybe you have some pre-existing issues, just take it slow, because there's no point in ruining your hands or wrists and then not being able to knit at all. What process do you... I think the question is, what's my process for deciding what I want to knit or make next? And that's a really interesting question. Most of the time, I think I just get inspired by watching podcasts, by checking Instagram, by browsing Ravelry. I spend a lot of time on Ravelry, and you can search for like the hot right now patterns, and there's always new stuff on there. So I just get inspired a lot through that. I also oftentimes I will, for example, finish a project and go to my stash and pick a yarn. And I will just decide I want to knit with this gray finu. And I want to knit a sweater out of this. And then I will just start the other way around. So I will maybe plug this yarn into Ravelry and see what other people have made from this yarn. Or if I don't do that, I will either know my gauge or do a gauge swatch, and then browse Ravelry by gauge. So you can put in, I want to see all sweater patterns that have a gauge of, I don't know, 19 to 23 stitches per 4 inches, and I would like to use only one color. And you know, that way you can also, of course, find patterns if you want to knit with a specific yarn. But of course, you don't need to plug that yarn in necessarily, because you may just say, I have 10 different fingering weight sweaters in my queue, and I will choose just one of them. So I think it goes a lot of different ways for me. Other times I will know I definitely want to knit another Sunset Highway sweater, and I will go to my stash and pull out different combinations. I don't really have a set process. A couple of people asked me about like make 9 and sweater plans for the future and what garments or knits I plan to make, and I don't really make these plans. I specifically did not do a make 9 because how do I know what I want to make in 6 months? I have no idea. Like, I focus on what I want to make right now and maybe what I need in my wardrobe, but if I put something as a plan, I'm not going to want to do that. Which, if you do that, if you're that way, that's totally fine. It's just not how I work. So when I buy yarn, I have a rough idea. So I have this yarn and I know I'm going to do some kind of garment with it. But I will decide later, and there will be a ton of garments that come up on Instagram, and I will have the yarn ready. So I'm a very strong believer in, for myself personally, not planning everything out to a certain degree, but just having the stash that I need and having some ideas about my stash, having a stash that is somewhat compatible with the things that I tend to like to knit. And then I just kind of go from whatever strikes my fancy. I do try to have only a limited amount of whips, so I try not to have more than 2, sometimes 3 sweaters on the needles. I try not to have more than 2 pairs of socks on the needles. So I try to keep it manageable, but I don't have a set process. How often are you asked if you would knit for someone, and would you ask for a fee? So in the beginning of my knitting career, a lot of people asked me to knit for them. And I mean, you all know this. It's not really possible if you want to knit with nice yarn. Someone once had knitted for them. You can never do that with nice yarn and make proper money of it, I think, because if you charge for the hours that it takes you to knit for them and the yarn, I mean, no one's going to buy a hat from you for like, I don't know, 60, 70, 80 euros. I didn't knit for other people in the past. I like knitting for people as gifts. So either completely as gifts, or I will say, you buy the yarn, I will tell you what yarn I'm happy to use. Here are some choices, and then, if I'm someone's friend, I will knit them that object if they really want it. But that is not really, I'm not selling my knits. I've never done that. I don't ever plan to do that. Non-knitters are very, very confused by that. Like, why would you knit all these things and not make money of them? But I primarily like to knit for myself or for people who are really knit worthy, in which case I don't mind if I don't make money of it. In the beginning of my knitting career, I actually knit more for other people. I even knit an entire cardigan for a friend once, and I don't know if she ever wore it. So by now I'm a little bit more picky, and I will only knit garments for people who I really, really know will love them. But I'm happy to knit gifts for friends and friends of family and such. I think what we are going to do is I'm going to cut it off here, and we are going to do a second video, and that way it will be a little bit more manageable. So I really, really hope that you find these answers somewhat helpful so far. I'm doing my best to provide you with some interesting answers, and yeah, I really hope you liked it so far, and if you did, maybe you will come back to part 2. So thank you so much for watching. Bye!